I covered a bruise with foundation that morning. My father's voice echoed in the Halern Tower elevator. Try harder. The bruise was a gift from my stepfather, a reply to my question about Mom's insurance. At 9:02 a.m., my phone buzzed. Incoming wire cleared. A smile touched my lips. The web I'd woven for years had just pulled taut. They thought I was weak, they forgot I work in risk. I make vulnerabilities their liability. My name is Ava Morin. I am 32 years old and I am a senior risk analyst. Monday began with the smell of burnt coffee and the sterile, Arctic hum of the industrial-grade air conditioning on the 31st floor of VINX Systems headquarters. The conference room, named Synergy, was a glass cage suspended over the city, its panoramic windows displaying a muted grey skyline that promised rain. The air inside was thin and cold, recycled to the point of tasting like nothing, like the future of corporate breathing. Everything was chrome, glass, and black leather, a room designed for clean, bloodless decisions, and I was the subject on the agenda. I sat at the polished obsidian table, my posture a carefully constructed model of professional poise. My spine was straight, my hands resting on the cool surface, one neatly placed over the other. My left hand covered my right wrist, obscuring a thin, minimalist bracelet of brushed steel. The bracelet was cold against my skin, a constant, faint pressure that served as a more precise reminder than the dull, throbbing ache beneath it. The dark purple and blue blooming on my inner wrist was a secret kept between me, my concealer, and the cool metal. It was a data point from a different kind of risk assessment, one conducted in the quiet violence of a suburban home. Across from me, Mason Cole, Vice President of Strategic Operations, leaned forward. He was a man who occupied space with an unearned confidence, his expensive suit stretched tight across a frame softening with success, and long lunches. His cologne, something sharp and citrusy, cut through the stale air, an invasive sensory detail. He smiled a practiced, paternalistic smile that never reached his eyes. Those eyes were small, shrewd, and currently fixed on me with a look of manufactured disappointment. To his right sat Linda from Human Resources, a woman whose entire professional existence seemed dedicated to sanding the sharp edges off of corporate cruelty and presenting it as a smooth, manageable stone. She had a folder open in front of her, its contents hidden, though I knew its purpose as intimately as I knew the security protocols for our Tier 1 servers. Ava, Mason began, his voice a low, confidential rumble meant to imply this was a difficult conversation for him. We've been reviewing the quarterly performance metrics. And well, we've had to make some tough calls. He steepled his fingers, a gesture he'd likely learned from a seminar on projecting authority. This cycle, your performance has been flagged as needs improvement. The phrase landed in the silent room with a dull thud. It was a meticulously chosen euphemism, corporate jargon designed to wound without leaving a visible mark. It meant you were failing. It meant you were on your way out. Linda cleared her throat, a dry, papery sound. She didn't look at me, instead focusing on the document in her folder. She began to read in a steady, dispassionate monotone, as if reciting the ingredients on a cereal box. Pursuant to VINX Company Policy 4.17b, a Performance Improvement Plan, or PIP, has been drafted to provide a structured pathway back to an acceptable standard of work. She slid the document across the table. It was 3 pages of dense, single-spaced text, a pre-signed death warrant. The plan was a masterpiece of corporate gaslighting, vague deficiencies, a lack of proactive engagement in team settings, inconsistent delivery on non-core project timelines, a perceived negative influence on departmental morale. Each point was an unsubstantiated claim, impossible to disprove, a ghost I was now tasked with fighting. The goals it set were equally ambiguous and entirely subjective, contingent on Mason's personal approval. It was a trap designed to be failed. I let the silence stretch for a moment, listening to the hum of the HVAC system. I looked from Mason's faux sympathetic face to Linda's impassive one. I did not look at the PIP. Instead, I turned to my laptop. My movements were deliberate and economical. I woke the screen, and my fingers moved across the keyboard with a speed and certainty that seemed to momentarily surprise them. I opened a single file. Speaking of performance and risk, I said, my voice even and cool, a stark contrast to the boiling pressure behind my ribs. I turned the laptop so the screen faced them. On it was a risk matrix, a complex grid of red, yellow, and green squares I had designed myself. It was a visual representation of every potential point of failure within our strategic supply chain. Mason had praised this very model in a department-wide email 3 months ago. He had even asked me to run a simulation on vendor integrity, calling it a special project. This is the vendor stress test you requested, Mason, I explained. My tone was purely informational. The simulation identifies potential breaches of contract, financial instability, and ethical conflicts based on an analysis of shell corporations and payment flows. My cursor hovered, then clicked, isolating a specific cluster of data points deep in the red quadrant, the box labeled High Probability Catastrophic Impact. A network of lines appeared, all converging on a single central node. In that node, in bold white font against the blood-red background, was the name Mason Cole. It was linked to a series of Shell LLCs, all receiving consulting fees through a subsidiary he had personally approved. These LLCs were the sole source providers for critical components, billing at a 300% markup. Mason's smile vanished, his face hardened, the paternalistic mask falling away to reveal the cold, hard ambition beneath. That's not relevant to this discussion. Ava, he said, his voice clipped. This meeting is about your performance, not your side projects. Linda, from HR, chimed in, please close the laptop. We need to focus on the plan at hand. Their reaction was the final piece of confirmation I needed. This wasn't about my work, it was about what I had found. I had become a risk that needed to be managed, and a PIP was the corporate equivalent of a neat, quiet execution. I held Mason's gaze for a fraction of a second longer than was comfortable, then slowly, deliberately closed the file. I did not shut down the laptop. I simply let the screen go back to the neutral corporate desktop background. I glanced at the digital clock in the corner, 9 a.m., on schedule. As if summoned by the thought, my phone, lying face down on the table, gave a single silent vibration. It was a haptic buzz. As I had programmed myself, distinct from any other notification, my heart, which had been beating a steady, controlled rhythm, seemed to stop for one long, painful beat, then restarted with a jolt. I casually reached for it, my movements betraying no urgency. Under the lip of the table, I angled the screen toward me. A single text message from a secure, encrypted number labeled only Northbridge Trust. The message contained 3 words, *wire pending settlement. The air rushed back into my lungs. It was happening. The first domino, the one I had set up years ago, was about to fall. The intricate, patient mechanism I had built in the shadows was activating. A cold calm washed over me, displacing the hot anger. The game had changed. They just didn't know it yet. I looked up at them, my expression softening into one of resigned acceptance. I let my shoulders slump just a little. I allowed a flicker of vulnerability to show in my eyes. I was the victim now. I would play the part they had written for me. I nodded slowly. I understand, I said, my voice quiet. I pulled the PIP towards me. I picked up the heavy, branded pen they had provided. My hand, when I went to sign, trembled. It was a genuine tremor, born of adrenaline and years of suppressed rage, but I controlled it, refined it. It was not the violent shaking of a person falling apart, but the subtle, fine quiver of someone under immense, unbearable pressure, just enough to be noted, just enough to be inconsistent with my usual steady signature. A forensic detail. A seed of doubt to be planted in a future courtroom, should it be needed. When my signature on this document was compared to 1,000 others, I signed my name on the line, the ink as stark black against the pristine white paper. I slid the document back across the table. "I'll do my best," I whispered, the perfect final line for the defeated employee. Mason's smile returned, this time one of genuine relief. He had neutralized the threat. "I know you will, Ava," he said, standing up. "That's all we ask." Linda gathered the papers, her expression unchanging. The meeting was over. I had been judged, sentenced, and had signed my own confession. I stood, gathered my laptop and phone, and walked out of the conference room without another word. The office was a low hum of activity. A few heads turned in my direction, eyes full of pity or curiosity before quickly looking away. News traveled fast. I was now damaged goods. As I walked toward the elevator bank, I pulled out my phone again and opened the voice recorder app. I held it close to my mouth, shielding it with my hand as if checking a message. "Memo for the record," I said, my voice a low, steady whisper that the phone's microphone would capture perfectly. Monday, 9:05 a.m. I have been placed on a fraudulent performance improvement plan by Mason Cole. In direct retaliation for uncovering financial misconduct, this marks day one of the response protocol. I stopped the recording and saved the file. It was immediately automatically uploaded to a secure off-site server, timestamped and geolocated. Another piece of evidence, another stone in the foundation of their ruin. The elevator arrived with a soft chime. The doors slid open, revealing an empty car with walls of polished steel, reflective as mirrors. I stepped inside and turned to face my own reflection as the doors closed, shutting out the muted sounds of the office. The woman in the reflection was pale. Her face was a mask of professional control. Her suit was immaculate. Her hair was perfect, but her eyes told a different story in their depths. Two people stared back at me. One was the victim, the woman with a bruise on her wrist and a fraudulent document now in her HR file, a person cornered and threatened. The other was the architect of a plan years in the making, a cold, patient analyst who had just confirmed the final variable in a complex equation of revenge. The victim provided the motive. The analyst would provide the means. They were both me. And in the silent, descending elevator, we were in perfect, terrifying agreement. The board was set, the pieces were in motion, and I was done playing defense. My father, Elliot Murrin, was a mechanic. His hands were a road map of healed cuts and calluses, permanently stained with the ghost of motor oil. They were strong, capable hands that could diagnose an engine's ailment by sound alone, but they were never raised to me. His mantra, delivered over the hood of a sputtering engine or a difficult piece of homework, was always the same: try harder, Ava. It wasn't a criticism, it was a statement of faith. It meant you have the capacity, now apply the will. He smelled of grease and iron filings. The honest scent of work. He died when I was 17, a sudden, clean break in the timeline of my life, a heart attack that gave no warning. The scent of iron and oil was replaced by the cloying sweetness of funeral flowers. The world went quiet. 2 years later, my mother married Victor Bale. He was my stepfather. Victor's hands were soft and pale, unused to labor. He smelled of expensive aftershave and the faint, sour tang of whiskey. He moved into our house, my father's house, and began to change things, small things. At first, he replaced the solid oak front door with one that had ornate, useless glass panels. He paved over my mother's garden for a second parking space. He occupied space my father had built, and he did it with the effortless confidence of a man who believes he is an upgrade. Victor and I were fundamentally different file types. He operated in the world of cash, of handshakes, of conversations that left no echo. He hated paper trails, he saw them as a liability, a cage. I, on the other hand, found comfort in documentation. I loved receipts, timestamps, notarized signatures. I believed in the immutable truth of a well-kept ledger. To me, a paper trail wasn't a cage, it was a weapon. It was proof. It was memory made solid. My mother's illness was slow, then fast, a decline I charted in prescription receipts and hospital copays. When she died, there was a life insurance policy, a substantial one, the final act of my father's long-term planning. The money was deposited into the joint account she had shared with Victor. Within 48 hours, the account balance was zero. A single, clean wire transfer to an untraceable holding company. I found the transaction on a Tuesday morning, sitting at the kitchen table he now presided over. The screen glowed with the stark reality of the number zero. "Where did it go, Victor?" I asked, my voice flat. He was stirring his coffee, his movements unhurried. He didn't look at me. "Investments, Ava. Making money work for us. Don't worry your pretty little head about it." "I want to see the paperwork," I said. He finally looked at me then, his smile thin and sharp. "It's handled. Don't go digging around in the past. It's unbecoming." The coffee maker gurgled in the silence. "I'm not digging in the past," I said, my eyes locked on his. "I dig for numbers." That was the day the war began. A cold war fought in the silence of a house that was no longer a home. At VINX, my world was also one of numbers, but the stakes felt different. Or they did, at first. My job was to model risk, to find the weak points in the system before they broke. I saw the company not as a collection of people, but as a vast, interconnected network of data flows, and in that data, I saw patterns. Mason Cole's department, Strategic Operations, was a black hole of financial anomalies. He sponsored procurement contracts that made no sense. He favored vendors who seemed to materialize out of thin air, LLCs with no history, no physical address, and a single opaque purpose. They were ghost ships sailing through the company's accounts, and Mason was their harbor master. My reports flagging these irregularities were always quietly buried, returned with a note, "Further analysis not required at this time." Mason was protected. He had a sponsor of his own, higher up the food chain. He was a known variable, a managed risk the company was willing to accept. I started my own ledger, a private one, a secure, encrypted file on a drive that never connected to the VINX network. I tracked the shell companies, the payment schedules, the inflated invoices. It was a hobby at first, a puzzle, a way to stay sharp. Then, one rainy Thursday afternoon, I found the connection. A new vendor had been fast-tracked for a software logistics contract. The approval had Mason's digital signature all over it. The company name was Bale Premier Logistics LLC. Bale. The name hit me like a physical blow, a jolt of ice water in my veins. It was a common enough name. I told myself it was a coincidence, but I knew it wasn't. In my line of work, I don't believe in coincidence. I believe in correlated data points. I did not ask Mason about it. I did not raise a flag. I did not make a sound. My face remained a mask of professional neutrality as I stared at the screen. My fingers moved, my keystrokes silent and efficient. I downloaded the entire contract packet, the articles of incorporation, the payment routing information, the signature blocks. I saved it all to my private ledger. The two battlefields of my life, home and work, had just merged into one. That night, the dynamic at home shifted. Victor knew I was looking. He couldn't prove it. He couldn't see the files, but he could feel the change in my silence. My silence was no longer passive, it was observant. He started drinking more heavily. His temper, always simmering beneath his smooth facade, began to fray at the edges. The lessons began. They were always about respect, about knowing my place, about what happens to girls who get too curious. He would corner me in the hallway, his voice a low, menacing growl, the smell of whiskey a suffocating cloud. "You think you're so smart," he'd hiss. "You and your little spreadsheets. Some things are best left alone." Sometimes he would grab my arm, his fingers digging into my flesh, a show of strength, a reminder of his physical power over me. Last night, his grip had been harder than usual. The question about my mother's insurance had been the trigger. The bruise on my wrist was the result. He was teaching me how to be silent, how to be afraid. I was learning, but I was learning a different lesson. I learned how to angle my body to minimize impact. I learned how to control my breathing to keep my heart rate from spiking. I learned to recognize the subtle shift in his eyes that signaled an impending rage. And after he would stumble off to bed, I would go to my room and document. I took photos of the bruises using my monitor's clock as a timestamp. I made audio notes, my voice a clinical whisper detailing the date, the time, the words he used, the specific threats he made. I uploaded everything to the same encrypted cloud that held the VINX data. Victor was teaching me silence, and I was learning evidence. My father's voice returned to me then, not as a memory, but as a command, *try harder *. It was no longer about a math problem, or a faulty alternator, it was a mandate for survival. It was an order to push through the fear, the pain, the exhaustion. Try harder because my mother's memory deserved justice. Try harder because my father's legacy was not this house of fear. Try harder because the men who thought I was a liability to be managed, Mason at the office, Victor at home, had fundamentally miscalculated their risk. They thought they were the predators, they didn't realize they had become the data points. Sitting at my desk late one night, the bruise on my wrist a dull ache, I opened a new file. It was a draft addendum for a minor, overlooked software contract at VINX. A deal so small Mason would never read the fine print. I began to type, my fingers flying across the keyboard. I was no longer just an analyst, I was an architect. I was designing a weapon disguised as a legal document. I was writing a single, elegant clause, burying it deep in the boilerplate that they would all one day come to hate. In the intricate ecosystem of corporate procurement, the most dangerous predators are often invisible. They are not the multi-billion-dollar acquisitions that dominate headlines, but the small, seemingly insignificant contracts that slide through legal review on a Friday afternoon. They are the barnacles on the hull of the corporate ship, unremarkable and ignored. The contract with Kestrel Indexer was one such barnacle. Kestrel was a small, brilliant software firm that had developed a proprietary data indexing algorithm. Their module was a masterpiece of efficiency, capable of cross-referencing and indexing petabytes of unstructured data with breathtaking speed. VINX wanted to license it for an internal project, a back-end optimization that would never see the light of day. The deal was worth less than a rounding error on the company's quarterly earnings. It was perfect. It was the Trojan horse I'd been waiting for. I was assigned to the risk assessment portion of the contract negotiation. My job was to ensure the terms protected VINX from liability. I did my job, and then I did my own. In the 47-page document, buried deep within a section detailing third-party intellectual property rights, I embedded a ghost. I called it the reverse exposure escrow clause. It was a piece of legal architecture, beautiful in its simplicity and its lethality. It was written in dense, but unambiguous language. It consisted of two primary triggers. Trigger 1, in the event that the licensed Kestrel module, or any derivative work thereof was redistributed or sublicensed to a VINX client without explicit written attribution to the original intellectual property holder. The the standard licensing fee would automatically double retroactively for every month of the violation. Trigger 2. In the event of a payment delay on any licensing fee, original or punitive, exceeding a 30-day net term for 3 consecutive instances, a pre-authorized third-party escrow service would be activated. This service would automatically garnish 15% of all gross revenue from the specific VINX product line utilizing the module until all outstanding fees were paid in full. The release of funds from this escrow was autonomous, governed by the smart contract rules embedded in the agreement, requiring no further authorization. It was a self-detonating bomb. The beauty of it was that it appeared on the surface to be a standard, albeit aggressive, IP protection clause. It was the kind of thing a small firm like Kestrel would want. VINX's legal team, overworked and understaffed, would skim it and see a minor financial risk on a minor contract. They would not see the true nature of the trap. The most critical detail, however, was the definition of the original intellectual property holder. The Kestrel module was built upon a foundational indexing framework that Kestrel itself had licensed. The framework was obscure, a piece of open-source code that had been acquired and privatized years ago. The current owner was a small, privately held entity registered in Delaware. The entity was named Marinhex LLC. I had formed Marinhex LLC 18 months prior using a portion of my own savings. I used a registered agent service, a firm that specialized in providing a layer of anonymity for beneficial owners. The name on the incorporation documents was not my own. It was that of a proxy, a retired corporate attorney I trusted implicitly, who for a fee and a belief in my cause, agreed to act as the sole managing member. My name appeared nowhere. The hex was a private joke, it was a spell, a piece of code. It was the foundation of the entire system. The Kestrel contract, with my additions, came to Mason Cole's desk on a Tuesday. He was busy, distracted by a conference call with the London office. He wanted to clear his queue before lunch. I presented him with a 2-page executive summary. The summary mentioned a robust IP protection clause in the annexes, but focused on the favorable pricing and the quick integration timeline. Looks good, he said. Ava, he'd said, not looking up from his phone. Just initial the summary. I trust your judgment. He scrolled his initials. A lazy MC on the bottom of the summary page. He never once asked to see the full document. He never flipped to the back, to the section I had carefully mislabeled as Annex E2B, Supplementary Data Processing Standards, a title so boring it actively repelled readership. In that moment, his arrogance, his carelessness, became a legally binding part of my plan. The signed document was scanned, but before it was sent to Kestrel for their final signature, I performed one last step. I ran the final PDF through a cryptographic hashing algorithm, generating a unique SHA-256 hash. This hash, an alphanumeric string, was a unique digital fingerprint of the document in its exact state. Any change to the file, even by a single comma, would result in a completely different hash. I then submitted this hash, along with a copy of the contract, to a reputable digital notary service for a fee of $50. I received a time-stamped, cryptographically sealed certificate that proved beyond any possible doubt that this specific version of the contract existed at this specific time. Any future claim by VINX that the document had been altered would be instantly disproven. The evidence was absolute. It was mathematical. Then I waited. Patience is a weapon that sharpens with use. For 9 months, I watched. I performed my duties at VINX. I signed my fraudulent PIP check-in sheets. I endured Mason's condescending praise on my renewed focus. I went home to Victor's simmering rage and documented his every threat, every shove. And all the while, I watched the data flows at VINX as I knew it would. VINX's internal project utilizing the Kestrel module was a stunning success. It was too good to keep in-house. In the third quarter, the executive team made a decision. They would package the optimization technology and embed it as a value-added feature in their flagship data pipeline product, Continuum, which they sold to their most lucrative clients, including several major federal agencies. It was an act of corporate hubris so predictable it was almost comforting. In their rush to monetize the new capability, they buried the Kestrel module deep inside their own code. They wrapped it in VINX branding and launched it, just as the clause anticipated. They failed to provide any attribution to Marinhex LLC. Trigger 1 was now active. The licensing fees had doubled retroactively. I sent the first invoice from Marinhex LLC, via my attorney proxy, to VINX's accounts payable department. It was for the new, doubled amount. It was, as expected, ignored, lost in the bureaucracy, flagged as an anomaly, an error. The second invoice was also ignored. The third was returned with a curt note, amount disputed. That was all I needed, the third consecutive non-payment within the 30-day term. On a quiet Tuesday morning, an automated notification was sent from my proxy system to the third-party escrow service, a highly secure automated financial custodian based in Switzerland. The smart contract embedded in the original agreement Mason had initialed activated silently, without any human intervention. The escrow service began its work. It started to garnish 15% of the gross revenue from the Continuum product line, diverting the funds into a secure holding account. VINX wouldn't notice at first. It would be a statistical ghost in their massive revenue stream, a rounding error a junior accountant might flag and then dismiss, but it would grow. A quiet, steady bleed. The destination account for the escrowed funds, once released, was an account at Northbridge Trust. This was the final piece of the financial machinery. The moment that money landed, it would act as a key, unlocking the capital I needed for the next, much more public, phase of the plan. It would pay for the legal retainers, the forensic accountants, the expert witnesses. It would finance the war. While the financial bomb was ticking, I had been cultivating a second front. I monitored the security patch releases from Kestrel. 3 times in the past 6 months, they had issued critical vulnerability patches for their module. These were serious flaws, potential backdoors that could allow for a catastrophic data breach. Kestrel had notified VINX as per their licensing agreement, but VINX, in their arrogance, had never implemented the patches in the version of the module embedded in Continuum. They had created their own custom wrapper, and updating it was considered too much work for a component they didn't even publicly acknowledge. I documented each ignored patch notification. I ran my own simulations, confirming the vulnerabilities were active and exploitable in the live VINX product. I now had proof of not just contractual and financial breach, but of gross negligence. I had leverage against their federal clients, who had strict cybersecurity compliance mandates. Everything was in place. The legal trap was set and signed. The digital evidence was notarized and immutable. The financial siphon was active and draining them by the hour. The negligence case was documented and ready. The bait had been set. The fish had taken it. All that remained was to pull the line. The notification arrived at 7:41 p.m. It was not a call or an email, it was a text message, an intentionally impersonal and denigrating medium for a corporate execution. It came from a number I recognized as belonging to Linda in Human Resources. It was 2 lines of sterile, weaponized jargon. Due to non-cooperation with your performance improvement plan, your employment contract with VINX Systems is terminated, effective immediately. My thumb hovered over the screen for a moment. They expected a panicked call, a flurry of desperate emails, a plea. They had miscalculated the target. I typed a single word, a clean and simple acknowledgement of receipt that offered them nothing, received. I hit send. Then I deleted the thread. The message was an act of war, but they had failed to understand that I had launched my own campaign weeks ago. They thought this was the end. They didn't know the end had been written 30 days prior. On a quiet Wednesday afternoon, I had taken a personal day. I didn't go to a spa or a museum. I went to the downtown offices of a legal archiving service, a place that smelled of old paper and digital security. In my briefcase was a single encrypted solid-state drive. It contained the entire audit trail, every falsified invoice from Mason's shell companies, every ignored security patch notification from Kestrel, every saved voice memo detailing my fraudulent PIP meetings, every time-stamped photograph of Victor's lessons in silence. The clerk, a man who moved with the quiet precision of a librarian, took the drive. He verified the contents against my provided manifest, generated a new series of cryptographic hashes, and then, with a satisfying physical thud, stamped a certificate of receipt with the official seal of the county court. The data was no longer mine. It was evidence held in escrow by the legal system itself, a digital war chest waiting for my command. Back in the present, at my desk on the 31st floor, I began the process of separation. 2 uniformed security guards were approaching my cubicle, their steps heavy and deliberate. They were meant to be an audience for my humiliation. Mason was watching from the glass wall of his office, a faint, triumphant smirk on his face. I did not give them the satisfaction. I stood up before they reached me, my movements calm, unhurried. My personal effects were already in my bag. All that was left on the desk was my company-issued laptop and a set of keys. I unplugged the small USB-C device from my laptop. It was a U2 key, my personal hardware authenticator, the key to my own encrypted world. I clipped it to the inside of my bag. My key. Then I picked up the VINX key ring, the key card, the office key, the key to the server room. I was no longer meant to access their keys. I held them over the metal in tray on my desk and simply let them drop. The clatter of cheap metal on cheap metal was startlingly loud in the quiet office. It was a sound of finality. I know the way out, I said to the guards, my voice even. I didn't look at them. I looked past them, towards the elevators. I slung my bag over my shoulder. It contained my laptop, a wallet, and a single black moleskine notebook. I walked. The path through the office was a gauntlet of averted eyes and sudden, intense interest in computer screens. I was no longer a colleague. I was a ghost, a cautionary tale. I did not care. I saw the floor plan as a series of tactical positions. I saw my colleagues as potential witnesses. My mind was already drafting the opening statement for a wrongful termination lawsuit. The elevator doors closed, encasing me in mirrored steel. The reflection showed a woman who was, by all official accounts, unemployed, disgraced, a failure. But the reflection did not show the articles of incorporation for Marinhex LLC. It did not show the active escrow account siphoning their revenue. It did not show the notarized evidence cache waiting for a signal. They had fired a risk analyst. They did not understand they had just armed the primary risk itself. The key to my father's house felt heavy in my hand. The quiet click of the deadbolt turning was the only sound. The house was dark, save for the flickering blue light of the television in the living room. Victor was on the couch, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the table beside him. He had been waiting. The moment he saw me, he muted the TV and stood. "You," he snarled, the word thick with alcohol and rage. "What did you do?" He threw his phone down on the couch cushions. It bounced once. "My payments, the logistics fees, they were suspended this afternoon. An internal review," they said. He took a step towards me, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. "Then Mason Cole calls me, says, you've been a problem. Uncooperative. Says you're fired." You did this. You're trying to cut me off, aren't you? After everything I've done for you. I took one slow, deliberate step back, creating distance. It was a practiced defensive motion. My left hand came up as if to brace myself, a gesture of fear he would expect. My thumb found the small recessed button on the side of my smartwatch and pressed it twice. A single, imperceptible vibration against my skin confirmed it. The microphone was active. The ambient audio was being recorded and streamed directly to my secure cloud storage. The money I have coming to me, that's for my trouble. For putting up with you, he spat, advancing another step. He was inside my personal space now, a looming, volatile threat. I taught you to be quiet. I taught you respect. His right hand came up, fingers curled into a fist. It was a familiar gesture, a prelude, and in that split second, a thought, cold and sharp as a shard of glass, formed in my mind. Go on, do it again. Last night's bruise is already documented. A second entry, less than 24 hours later, would establish a clear pattern of escalating violence for the police report. The medical photos would be time-stamped, but he stopped. The fist remained clenched at his side, trembling with rage. He was enjoying the fear he thought he was causing. I used his pause. I continued my slow, backward retreat, my eyes locked on his. I didn't run. Running would be a victory for him. I moved with the deliberate calm of someone disengaging from a threat they have already assessed and neutralized. I reached the door to my bedroom. My hand found the knob behind my back. I turned it, opened the door, and stepped inside. Never turning my back on him, I closed the door. The heavy, solid core would shut out his snarled curse. The deadbolt I had installed myself, with its 3-inch throw, slid into the reinforced frame with a deep, satisfying thud. The sound of his fist hammering on the other side of the door was loud, but it was the sound of impotence. He was locked out. I walked to my bed and sat down. The adrenaline began to recede, replaced by a cold, clear focus. My hands were perfectly steady. I took out my phone. His enraged shouts were a muffled, rhythmic percussion in the background. I ignored them. I opened my calendar app. I created a new appointment for 8 a.m. the following morning. I found my doctor's practice in my contacts and listed it as the location. For the appointment title, I wrote, Medical Consultation Regarding Assault. I hit save. The appointment was the last piece I needed for this part of the plan. The recording was the narrative. The bruise was the physical proof. The doctor's report would be the official, undeniable armor. The morning light was flat and gray, the color of a computer screen before it powers on. I was sitting at the small desk in my bedroom, a mug of black coffee steaming untouched beside my keyboard. I had already been to the doctor. The nurse's touch had been gentle, her expression carefully neutral, as she photographed the constellation of bruises on my wrist and arm. The resulting medical report was now a time-stamped PDF, uploaded and saved in triplicate across my secure servers. Another document, another piece of the armor. I was not watching the clock. I was monitoring a secure banking portal, the kind used for international wire transfers. The screen was a simple, clean interface showing a single pending transaction. The details were all there. The routing numbers, the SWIFT code, the names of the sending and receiving entities. The status read, awaiting final clearing. Time seemed to slow, each second stretching into a long, audible beat. The hum of my laptop's fan was the only sound in the room. I was not anxious. I was not excited. I was an analyst watching a critical data point approach its threshold. The plan was a complex piece of machinery, and this was the moment the primary engine was set to engage. If my calculations were correct, if the chain of contractual obligations and financial triggers I had set in motion was as flawless as I believed it to be, then the status would change. If I had missed a single variable, a single legal loophole, then the screen would remain as it was, and the war would be over before it began. At 9:02 a.m., the screen refreshed. The single word pending vanished, replaced by a new word written in a calm, decisive green, cleared. Below it, the numbers settled into their final, beautiful configuration, asterisk incoming wire, 4 hours, $800, 1,000, USD. Asterisk. I exhaled slowly. The money wasn't from the escrow account, that was a separate, slower mechanism, a python squeezing its victim. This was the tiger. This was the result of a secondary agreement I had brokered with Kestrel Labs weeks ago. It was an exclusive 5-year licensing deal for the full rights to the Marinhex IP, a deal that would make their next-generation product untouchable. The deal had only one condition precedent: irrefutable proof that VINX Systems had willfully breached the initial, more limited contract. My termination, the ignored invoices, and the notarized evidence cache had provided that proof. Kestrel, eager to secure the technology and punish a company that had treated their work with such contempt, had been waiting for my signal. Their payment was not just a fee, it was a declaration of allegiance. The arrival of the funds was the second primary trigger. The money wasn't for me, it was the war chest. It unlocked the next and most expensive phase of the operation, the retainers for the team at Silver and Moore, one of the most ruthless corporate litigation firms in the country, the fees for the forensic accountants, who would trace every dollar Mason and Victor had stolen, the hourly rates for the cybersecurity experts, who would testify about VINX's gross negligence. I picked up my phone. I did not need to look up the number. I dialed. It was answered on the first ring. Mr. Silver's office. This is Ava Morin, I said. Put me through. A click, then a new voice, smooth and sharp as honed steel. Ava. I was hoping to hear from you this morning. Is it time? The funds are cleared, I said. There was no need for pleasantries. He wasn't my friend, he was my weapon, chosen for his precision and his lack of sentimentality. File the TRO today. Consider it done, he said, a hint of predatory excitement in his voice. The petition is ready. The exhibits are attached. The server is on standby. He didn't need to list the exhibits, I knew them by heart. Exhibit A, the digitally notarized contract with its SHA 256 hash. Exhibit B, the annex containing the reverse exposure escrow clause. Exhibit C, the chain of ignored invoices. Exhibit D, the new medical report from 8:15 a.m. this morning, detailing non-accidental contusions. They had everything. They are locked and loaded. Good, I said, and hung up. The next sequence of events was already in motion, a series of parallel operations designed to strike VINX from multiple directions at once. As my lawyers were filing the request for a temporary restraining order with the court, a pre-written email was being sent from Kestrel Labs' legal department. It was a formal notice of termination of their licensing agreement with VINX, citing material breach. That notice was not just sent to VINX's general counsel, it was carbon copied to the procurement and compliance officers of every single federal client on the Continuum product line. Kestrel was not just cutting the cord, they were setting fire to the bridge and making sure VINX's most important customers had a front row seat. Now it was time for my move. I opened a new email draft. My fingers moved quickly, precisely. In the to field, I typed the email address of Eleanor Vance, the chairwoman of the VINX Audit Committee. She was a former federal prosecutor, with a reputation for zero tolerance. She was the one member of the board of directors who could not be bought or intimidated. For the subject line, I chose my words with the care of a munitions expert. Subject: urgent notification of material breach. Undisclosed financial exposure. Willful negligence. The body of the email was short. It was not an emotional plea. It was a professional notification of risk, the kind I was paid to write. It informed her that the company was in violation of multiple contracts, that a significant portion of its flagship product's revenue was subject to immediate garnishment, and that its federal clients were being formally notified of critical, unpatched security vulnerabilities in the software they were using. I attached 2 documents, the contract addendum and the most recent, ignored Kestrel security patch warning. I did not mention Mason. I did not mention my termination. I did not mention Victor. I let the data speak for itself. It was colder, cleaner, and far more damning. My cursor hovered over the send button. This was the point of no return. This was the formal declaration of war against the company itself. I looked at the clock, 10:17 a.m. I clicked the button. The screen gave a slight flicker as the email left the outbox. A quiet sound for such a significant action. For 4 minutes, the house was silent. I listened to the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of a siren. I was a strategist, watching the first missiles arc across the sky, waiting for the impact. At 10:21 a.m., the impact came, not to my inbox, but to my front door. A loud, violent banging erupted, the sound of a fist hitting solid wood. It was followed by Victor's voice, a distorted, guttural roar of pure rage. "Ava, open this damn door, what did you do?" The sound was shocking in its ferocity. He was unhinged. I did not move from my chair. I swiped the screen of my phone. Opening the app for the smart doorbell camera I had installed a month ago, the live feed filled the screen. It showed Victor, his face purple with rage, his body language a taut wire of violence. He was hammering on the door with both fists, his shoulders heaving. The camera's microphone picked up every word, every snarled curse, every threat. I watched, my expression calm. He was providing Exhibit E. I did not go to the door. I did not shout back. I let him continue his performance for the camera. Then, with my other hand, I dialed 3 numbers. 911, what is your emergency? The operator's voice was a calm, dispassionate drone. I'd like to report a domestic disturbance in progress, I said, my own voice a perfect mirror of her professional calm. I gave her the address. There is a man attempting to break down my front door. Is the man known to you? Yes, I said, watching Victor on my screen as he kicked the door, making the frame shudder. He is my stepfather. His name is Victor Bale. Are you in a safe location? Yes, I am in a locked room. Okay. We have officers on the way. Stay on the line. Thank you, I said. Please have the responding officer's reference case numbers 72491B and 81644C. They are my prior reports against the same individual. There was a pause on the other end of the line, the sound of typing. The operator's professional tone sharpened with a new, focused interest. This was not a first-time call, this was a documented history. I have the files, And you're saying the incident is in progress right now? I glanced at my phone. The video feed was clear. The audio pristine. Yes, I replied, a cold, hard finality in my voice. This time I have it on camera. At 10 a.m., I joined the VINX system's third quarter earnings call. I used a voice modulator, a simple piece of software that lowered the pitch of my voice by a few semitones, rendering it anonymous and gender neutral. I was not Ava Murrin, the recently terminated employee. I was a Murrin shareholder, holder of 10 shares of VINX common stock, a retail investor, a ghost in their machine. The call began with the usual platitudes. The CEO, a man named Richards, whose voice was a smooth, practiced baritone, read from a script filled with optimistic projections and corporate buzzwords. He spoke of synergistic alignments and leveraging core competencies. He painted a picture of a company in robust health, a steady ship navigating calm waters. It was a masterpiece of fiction. Then he handed the floor to Mason Cole. Mason's voice was confident, almost arrogant. He was the VP of Strategic Operations, the architect of the very strategy that was about to bring the company to its knees. He spoke about the Continuum product line, his flagship initiative. He lauded its unprecedented market penetration and strong, stable growth trajectory. He was, in effect, proudly displaying the strength of the branch he was sitting on, unaware that I was holding a saw. I listened to his voice, the same voice that had condescendingly placed me on a PIP, and felt nothing, no anger, no satisfaction, only the cold, detached focus of a demolition expert listening to the final countdown. The presentation concluded, and the operator opened the line for questions. The first few came from the major investment banks. They were predictable softball questions about revenue guidance and market share. Mason and Richards answered them with practiced ease, their words a soothing balm for the market. I waited. I let them build their narrative of stability. I let them construct the house of cards to its full, precarious height. The operator's voice returned. We have time for one last question. Go ahead, caller. This was my slot. I unmuted my microphone. The silence of my room pressed in around me. My question is for Mr. Cole, I said, my modulated voice a low, anonymous rumble. You spoke at length about the stable growth of the Continuum pipeline. Could you please provide a disclosure on the recent termination of the Kestrel Indexer software module license, which I understand is a core component of that pipeline, and comment on the company's financial exposure resulting from that termination? The line went silent. It was not the normal pause of a person gathering their thoughts, it was a dead, absolute void, a vacuum. The smooth, uninterrupted flow of corporate narrative had hit a brick wall. In that silence, I could picture the scene in their boardroom, the panicked glances, the frantic scribbling on notepads, the beads of sweat on Mason's forehead. The 2 seconds of dead air felt like 20. It was the sound of a system crashing. Finally, a new voice cut in, sharp and defensive. It was the General Counsel, a man I recognized from the company's leadership page. This is VINX Legal, he said, his voice tight. We don't comment on hypotheticals or speculative rumors regarding our vendor relationships. Hypotheticals. It was the perfect, predictable lie. But it was too late. The question was out there. The seed of doubt had been planted on a live, recorded call with dozens of financial analysts. As the lawyer spoke, my phone, lying beside my keyboard, lit up with a single, silent notification. It was a text from Mr. Silver. *TRO granted by Judge Albright, effective immediately. Serve now. The judge's name was a beautiful detail. Albright was known for her brutal efficiency and her utter contempt for corporate malfeasance. The temporary restraining order was no longer a request, it was a court-mandated reality. It was a weapon, and it was now in my hand. I minimized the conference call window. On my desktop, 2 pre-drafted emails were waiting. The first was addressed to the Market Surveillance and Compliance Division of the New York Stock Exchange. The second was addressed to the Senior Legal Counsel of VINX's cloud services provider. The subject line for both was the same, urgent, service of court-ordered TRO. VINX Systems, VXSY. Attached to each was the PDF of the judge's order, complete with a digital signature, and the official seal of the district court. The order was simple and brutal. It legally compelled VINX to immediately cease and desist from using, distributing, or profiting from the intellectual property owned by Marinhex LLC. It also compelled any third-party service provider, upon receipt of the order, to immediately suspend any services that enabled this infringement. My fingers moved. I hit send on the first email. Then I hit send on the second. The time on my monitor read 1:23 p.m. On the conference call, the General Counsel was still talking, trying to steer the conversation back to safe harbor statements and forward-looking projections, but his words were just noise. The real action was now happening in the silent, invisible world of digital infrastructure. The email to the cloud provider would have been received by an automated legal intake system. It would have parsed the subject line and the attachment, identified the key terms, temporary restraining order, VINX systems, and immediately routed it to a high-priority queue. A human lawyer would have it on their screen within 60 seconds. They would verify the authenticity of the court order, a process that would take another minute. Then they would issue a command. They would have no choice. To ignore a federal judge's order would be to invite catastrophic legal consequences upon their own company. The command would be simple: revoke the license keys associated with the infringing component in the continuum pipeline. On the live audio feed of the earnings call, Mason was attempting to answer a follow-up question, his voice strained. He was referencing a slide on the presentation deck, talking about user engagement metrics. And as you can see from the dashboard, our real-time analytics show a 30% increase in. He stopped mid-sentence. The silence that followed was different from the first. It was not a silence of shock, it was a silence of confusion. On the other end of the line, in their state-of-the-art boardroom, a screen had just gone blank. A dashboard powered by the very pipeline we were discussing had just flatlined. The Kestrel module, the heart of their analytics engine, had been deactivated. Its license was revoked. The pipeline was broken. A new sound entered the audio feed, a frantic, muffled whispering, a shuffling of papers. The professional facade of the earnings call was cracking, collapsing in real time. Simultaneously, the stock ticker for VXSY, which I had opened in a small window in the corner of my screen, turned red. It began to drop, first by pennies, then by dimes, then by a full dollar. The email to the NYSE had been received. The market was reacting. Whispers from the analysts on the call were already spreading through chat rooms and private messages. Kestrel termination, TRO. News of the Kestrel notification to federal clients was leaking. A toxic catalyst poured into an already volatile situation. Clients with government contracts don't wait for official confirmation. They paused payments first and asked questions later. The revenue stream was freezing. The CEO, Richards, came back on the line, his voice tight with forced calm. "It appears we are experiencing some technical difficulties," he said. "We will conclude our call here. A full transcript will be made available." The line went dead. A sudden, sharp click followed by the dull hum of a dial tone. They had hung up. They had cut the cord in the middle of their own earnings call, an act of corporate panic so profound it was almost unprecedented. I sat back in my chair. The dial tone, a beautiful final note in the symphony of their destruction. The room was silent again. I looked at the stock ticker. VXSY was now down $5.710. It was in free fall. I leaned my head back and closed my eyes, taking a long, slow breath. The air tasted clean. I felt no joy, no elation, just a quiet, grim sense of finality. The plan was no longer a theoretical exercise. The numbers on the screen were no longer projections. It was real. The knife had found the artery. The chaos I had unleashed was digital, a storm raging in stock tickers and encrypted servers. The next phase of the war would be fought with paper, with the cold, hard facts of two separate ledgers, one corporate, one domestic, that I was about to merge into a single damning document. While the VINX board was scrambling to understand the technical and financial implosion of their earnings call, I was composing a new email. This one was not addressed to the board's chairwoman, but to the full, unredacted distribution list for the VINX Board of Directors, their General Counsel, and the external auditors at Deloitte. The subject line was an equation of guilt, cross-reference vendor file 77B4, Bail Premier Logistics LLC. State Insurance Fraud Case NV 881C2. The body of the email was a masterpiece of cold, factual correlation. I presented the information not as an accusation, but as a risk analyst presenting newly discovered data points that had a material impact on the company's ethical and financial standing. I began with a simple statement of fact: Vendor 77B4, Bail Premier Logistics LLC, approved by VP Mason Cole, lists a single managing member on its articles of incorporation, Mr. Victor Bail. Beneath this, I embedded a side-by-side comparison. On the left was a screenshot of the VINX vendor payment portal showing a consulting fee of $75,000 paid to Bail Premier Logistics. The payment was dated 2 years ago. On the right was a redacted bank statement from my mother's estate account. It showed a wire transfer of her life insurance payout, initiated and cleared on the exact same date. The amounts were different, but the timing was a statistical impossibility, a screaming red flag that any competent auditor would have seen. A significant payment was made to Bail Premier Logistics on the same day substantial funds were misappropriated from an account to which Mr. Bail was a signatory. This may represent a conflict of interest and potential commingling of illicitly obtained funds with VINX corporate assets, constituting a money laundering risk. I wrote my language deliberately neutral and sterile. The final attachment was an audio file labeled with a simple, clinical title, V. Bail Statement of Intent. Wave. It was the recording from my smartwatch from the previous night, when Victor had admitted his entitlement. His voice, thick with whiskey and rage, was perfectly clear: the money I have coming to me, that's for my trouble. For putting up with you. I provided no context. The audio, paired with the financial documents, was its own narrator. The two ledgers were now one. I hit send. Then I deleted the email from my sent folder and wiped the cache. The message was gone from my machine, but it was now multiplying on theirs. A virus in their system. My next stop was the North Vale County Police Department. The building was old, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and disinfectant. I did not ask for a specific officer. I asked to file a formal complaint regarding insurance fraud and to supplement an existing domestic violence file. I sat across from a detective whose face was a mask of weary patience. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I presented my case as I would a risk analysis. I handed him a thumb drive. On this drive, I said, you will find the financial records showing the theft of my mother's life insurance policy by my stepfather, Victor Bail. I pointed to a specific folder. In this folder is an audio recording from last night, in which he references his right to that money. I pointed to another. And in this folder, you will find a high-definition video with audio from my doorbell camera, recorded at 10:21 a.m. this morning. It shows Mr. Bail attempting to break down my front door while issuing verbal threats. This is a violation of the restraining order I filed 6 months ago. The detective's expression shifted from weary to focused. He took the drive. We'll review this, he said. An hour later, my lawyer received a call. The North Vale DA's office had officially opened a criminal investigation into Victor Bail for felony insurance fraud and aggravated assault. The system, slow and indifferent, had finally been given data it could not ignore. The fallout at VINX was swift. An emergency virtual board meeting was convened. By late afternoon, an internal memo was circulated. Mason Cole was suspended, effective immediately, pending the results of an internal review. It was a corporate execution. His name was a liability, and the board was cutting it loose before it could sink them further. My phone buzzed with a text from an unsaved number. I knew who it was. You're killing this family. You're destroying everything. It was Victor. He was no longer shouting at my door, he was screaming into the void of a text message. I took a screenshot of the message, with the time and number clearly visible. I forwarded the image to Mr. Silver with a one-word caption, Exhibit F. Every communication was another nail. That evening, I had the locks on the house changed. The locksmith was a quiet man with hands as callous and sure as my father's had been. As he worked, I showed him a photo on my phone, a picture I had taken of the door frame after Victor's assault that morning. It showed a deep, splintering crack in the wood near the deadbolt. Can you confirm that this damage is consistent with a forced entry attempt? I asked. He peered at the photo, then at the frame he was working on. He ran a thumb over the splintered wood. Oh yeah, he said, not looking up. Somebody put their shoulder into this hard, more than once. Would you be willing to sign a statement to that effect? He glanced at me, his eyes sharp and perceptive. He saw the bruise on my wrist that my sleeve didn't quite cover. For you, he said, his voice low. Absolutely. With the new, heavy-duty deadbolt in place, I felt a sense of security I hadn't realized I'd lost. The house was mine again. I spent the next hour writing. It was a 600-word letter addressed to the employees of VINX Systems. It was not an emotional tell-all, it was my final risk report. I used no adjectives like unfair, unethical, or angry. I used only nouns and verbs, data and consequences. I detailed the timeline of the ignored security patch warnings. I explained in simple terms the contractual liability the company now faced. I outlined the systemic failure of a management culture that punished those who identified risk instead of rewarding them. I did not mention my name. I signed it simply, a concerned analyst. I sent it from an anonymous, encrypted email address to a single low-level employee in the marketing department whom I knew to be an incorrigible gossip. Then I shut down my computer. The next morning, it was on the front page of the Northvale Ledger's digital edition. The headline was stark, Whistleblower in Risk Department Cuts Company Pipeline, Alleges Gross Negligence. The article contained my letter in full. The leak had taken less than 12 hours. I did not read the article. I did not read the comment section. The public narrative was no longer my concern. I had provided the data. The world could draw its own conclusions. Instead, I went to the garage. It still smelled faintly of oil and metal, my father's scent. I found his old grease gun, the metal cool and heavy in my hand. I went back to the new front door. The locksmith had done a good job, but the hinges were stiff. I carefully, precisely, applied a small amount of grease to each one, wiping away the excess with a clean rag. I opened and closed the door a few times. The squeak was gone, replaced by a smooth, near-silent swing. It closed with a quiet, satisfying click. It was a small thing, a simple mechanical act, but it was something my father would have done. He was a man who fixed things. And in the quiet of the morning, as the company I had served burned and the man who had hurt me faced the law, I felt, for the first time, like I was finally fixing something, too. The hallway of the district courthouse was a study in institutional beige. The linoleum floors were scuffed with the ghosts of 1,000 anxious footsteps. The air was thick and stagnant, smelling of old paper and cheap disinfectant. We were not in a courtroom, but in the neutral liminal space outside, a purgatory where justice was not dispensed but bargained for. On one of the worn wooden benches sat Mr. Silver and I. Across from us, standing, were two men from VINX. The senior of the two was Marcus Thorne, the company's general counsel. He was a tall man in a suit that cost more than my first car, his face a carefully composed mask of professional concern. Thorn cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet hallway. He began the negotiation with the predictability of a pre-programmed algorithm. This was his opening gambit, the standard corporate offering to make a problem disappear. Ms. Morin, he began, his voice smooth and reasonable. VINX is prepared to offer a generous settlement to resolve this matter amicably. We are proposing a severance package equivalent to 2 years of your salary, contingent upon the signing of a standard non-disparagement and non-disclosure agreement. It was exactly what I expected, a payoff, hush money. They saw me as a disgruntled employee who could be bought. They believed this was about money. They were wrong. Mr. Silva remained silent, looking at me. It was my move. I did not look at Thorn. I looked at the scuffed floor, tracing a crack in the linoleum with my eyes. First, I said, my voice quiet, but carrying clearly in the dead air, you will issue a public statement announcing the immediate and permanent termination of Mason Cole for ethical violations. Second, you will terminate all existing and future contracts with Bale Premier Logistics and any affiliated entities. Third, you will file an amended 8K with the SEC, fully disclosing the material risks associated with the Continuum pipeline and the IP infringement, correcting the misleading statements made on the earnings call. I paused, then finally lifted my eyes to meet Thorn's. His mask of concern had slipped, replaced by a flicker of genuine shock. After you have done those 3 things, I finished, then we can discuss the financial component. Thorn's junior associate, a young man who looked like he had never missed a day of Ivy League crew practice, shifted his weight nervously. Thorn himself recovered quickly, his professional armor snapping back into place. He gave a small, condescending smile. Ava, may I call you Ava? That is an extraordinary set of demands. What you are describing is not a settlement, it is a public flagellation. For any financial settlement to occur, we would require an absolute, ironclad NDA. No communication about your employment. Mason Cole, the company, its vendors, total silence. That is non-negotiable. He believed he had found my weakness. He believed he could cage me with legal boilerplate. I said nothing. Instead, I reached into my bag and took out my phone. My movements were slow, deliberate. I tapped the screen twice, opening the photo gallery to a specific image. It was the photo the nurse had taken at the doctor's office, a clinical, brightly lit close-up of my wrist. The bruise was a violent storm of purple, blue, and sickly yellow. The detail was sharp enough to see the faint impressions of fingers. I leaned forward and held the phone out to him. I did not say whose hand had done it. I did not mention Victor. I did not have to. The photo was not about him, it was about the principle of the thing. I was terminated for non-cooperation, I said, my voice low and cold. The truth is, I was terminated for identifying a risk that was linked to this. I gestured to the image on the screen. You want me to sign a document that legally obligates me to be silent about the culture that allowed this to happen. You want an NDA. I pulled the phone back and locked the screen, my gaze unwavering on his. I do not sign NDAs with violence. Thorn flinched. It was a small, almost imperceptible movement, but I saw it. He was a man of contracts and clauses, of abstract legal theories. He was unprepared for the visceral, undeniable reality of that photograph. He could not argue with it. He could not file a motion to dismiss it. It was a truth that transcended his legal maneuvering. He looked away, unable to hold my gaze. As Thorn struggled to regain his composure, Mr. Silva, who had been watching the exchange like a patient predator, made his move. He reached into his leather briefcase and produced a single folded letter. He did not hand it to Thorn, he slid it across the small, empty space between the benches. The thick, creamy paper glided silently across the polished wood, coming to a stop just inches from Thorne's perfectly polished shoes. "Perhaps this will help clarify my client's position," Silver said, his voice a quiet murmur. Thorne hesitated for a moment, then bent down to pick it up. He unfolded the letter. I watched his eyes scan the first few lines. I knew what they said. It was a formal letter of intent from Kestrel Labs. It outlined the terms of a 7-figure seed investment into a new venture, contingent on that venture securing the exclusive, perpetual rights to a certain proprietary indexing technology. The name of the new venture was at the bottom of the page, Marinhex LLC. The color drained from Thorne's face. It was a slow, visible transformation, the blood receding from his skin, leaving behind a pale, waxy sheen. In that moment, he understood the entire architecture of his negotiating strategy had collapsed. He was trying to buy the silence of a woman he thought was unemployed and desperate. He had just discovered he was facing a well-funded CEO, whose core asset was the very technology his own company had stolen and was now legally barred from using. My leverage wasn't just moral, it was financial. I didn't need their money. I had my own. He folded the letter with stiff, clumsy fingers and handed it back to Silver. His condescending smile was gone, replaced by a tight, grim line. A one-time, final payment, he said, his voice now strained, brittle. A clean break, no admission of wrongdoing, and no retrospective commentary on any statements made. The past is the past. It was his last desperate move on the chessboard, a weak attempt to salvage a draw from a losing position. I shook my head slowly. No, I said, the word soft, but it was absolute. I don't want your money. You can keep it. Thorne stared at me, his confusion now complete. Then what do you want? I want a public apology, I said. Not to me. I want a statement issued from the CEO's office, apologizing to the VINX engineering team for ignoring their concerns and for failing to implement critical security patches. And I want an apology to your clients for knowingly exposing them to risk. This was the checkmate. It was a demand he could not comprehend because it wasn't transactional. It wasn't about personal gain. It was about accountability. It was about restoring a small measure of integrity to the people who had been the collateral damage in Mason's and Victor's greed. Thorne looked at his watch, a nervous, reflexive gesture. He looked at his junior associate, who offered no help. He looked at the cracked linoleum floor. He was trapped. A protracted legal battle would mean discovery, depositions, and the public airing of every dirty secret I had documented. The photo of my wrist, the audio of Victor, the Kestrel letter, it would all become part of the public record. Settling on my terms was the only way to stop the bleeding. He let out a long, slow breath, a sound of profound defeat. We'll craft a statement, he conceded, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Today, I said. It was not a request, it was the final term of his surrender. He nodded, a single jerky movement. The negotiation was over. Outside our small bubble of conflict, the courthouse hallway remained unchanged. The air was still. The light from the long fluorescent tubes above flickered, emitting a low, almost subliminal hum. It was a sound I had blocked out before. But now, in the silence of my victory, I could hear it clearly. It sounded like a winch, pulling a heavy wire tighter, one excruciating notch at a time. The statement was released just before the market closed. It was a masterpiece of corporate legal speak, scrubbed clean of any real emotion, but it was a surrender nonetheless. I read it on my laptop screen. Each word a carefully placed stone in the tomb of the old VINX. VINX Systems acknowledges and expresses deep regret for recent lapses in our vendor oversight protocols and the improper use of licensed intellectual property within our Continuum product line. We are taking immediate and decisive action to rectify these failures. It was not an apology born of remorse. It was an apology born of a court order and a collapsed stock price, but it was public. It was permanent. It was a scar on their immaculate corporate face. The decisive actions followed with the speed of a guillotine. An internal memo, leaked within minutes, announced that Mason Cole's employment had been terminated, effective immediately, for violations of the company's code of ethical conduct. He was not suspended. He was not under review. He was a non-person. His digital existence at VINX scrubbed clean. His name a liability they had excised like a tumor. I felt a flicker of something, not triumph, but a cold, clinical satisfaction. The feeling an engineer might get from seeing a faulty component successfully removed from a complex machine. Another email, this one from Thorne's office, confirmed that all contracts with Bale Premier Logistics had been terminated and that VINX was pursuing legal action to claw back all fees paid. They were cauterizing the wound, severing all ties to the dirty ledger I had exposed. The final piece of that ledger fell into place, not with an email, but with a phone call from the North Vale detective. His voice was flat. Procedural. Just wanted to inform you that a warrant was served. Victor Bale was taken into custody about an hour ago. He's being processed now. Charges are insurance fraud and aggravated assault. I pictured it. Not a dramatic showdown, but the quiet, mundane reality of the law. A police cruiser at the curb. The click of handcuffs. A man who had built his life on bluster and intimidation being reduced to a case number. Justice was not a lightning bolt, it was paperwork. The next morning, an email from Vinx HR appeared in my personal inbox. It was an invitation to a restorative dialogue. They wanted to discuss a path forward and rebuild trust. The language was soft, conciliatory, and utterly meaningless. They wanted to put the ghost back in the machine, to make me a part of their recovery narrative. I did not reply. Instead, I opened a new draft. I addressed it to the newly appointed interim head of the engineering department. The subject was, Recommendations for Continuum Leadership. In the body, I wrote 4 names. They were the names of senior engineers, brilliant men and women who had been marginalized by Mason, whose warnings about the pipeline's vulnerabilities had been ignored for years. I outlined their specific contributions, their qualifications, their integrity. I recommended them for the promotions and leadership roles they had long deserved. I was not interested in restoring their trust. I was interested in restoring their competence. I hit send. Over the next few hours, my inbox began to fill with messages from anonymous VINX email addresses. They were short, simple notes, thank you. Finally, someone listened. You did what we were all too afraid to do. I read each one, then deleted it. They were not for me, they were messages in a bottle from people who had been stranded. A quiet confirmation that my war had not been fought in a vacuum. Later that evening, the house was silent. The new deadbolt on the door was a small, solid comfort. I poured a glass of water and stood before the simple wooden bookshelf, where I kept a framed photograph of my mother. She was smiling, her eyes bright, captured in a moment before the illness, before Victor. It's half done, Mom, I whispered to the smiling image. The words felt inadequate. I had avenged the money. I had broken the men who had hurt us, but justice could not bring her back. It could not erase the years of quiet fear. The victory was a cold, clean thing, but it did not fill the space she had left behind. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. A notification from Northbridge Trust. Settlement funds initiated. Estimated arrival 24 hours. The final transactional piece. The money from VINX. A settlement brokered by Silver to avoid a protracted wrongful termination suit was on its way. It was a substantial sum, but it felt like an afterthought, a closing entry in a ledger I was already done with. I picked up my car keys. I didn't know where I was going at first, but the car seemed to know the way. I found myself driving through the old industrial part of town, the streets quiet and deserted. I pulled up in front of a long, low brick building with a faded sign that read Morin Auto Repair. My father's garage. It had been sold after his death, but the new owners had never changed the sign. The air was cool and smelled of damp pavement, and the faint metallic tang of the nearby rail yard. I got out of the car and walked to the large bay door. I could see through the grimy window. The space inside was different, filled with new equipment, but the shape of it, the ghost of it, was the same. I could almost see him there, leaning over an engine block, a wrench in his hand. My eyes were drawn upward to the heavy, exposed wooden beam that ran the length of the ceiling. It was something I hadn't thought about in years, a memory buried under a decade of grief and anger. I could see it even in the dim light, the carving. I walked to the small side door. It was locked, but I knew my father. He had always kept a spare key on a small magnetic hook, tucked up under the lip of the steel rain gutter. I reached up, my fingers brushing against cold, dusty metal, and there it was. The key was cold in my hand. It slid into the lock with a familiar grating sound. The door swung open. The smell hit me first, oil, gasoline, rust, and that indefinable scent of cold steel. It was the smell of my father. It was the smell of my childhood. My eyes adjusted to the gloom. I walked to the center of the garage, directly under the main beam. I looked up. The letters were carved deep into the dark wood, rough and imperfect, made by a working man's hand, not an artist's. 2 words, asterisk try harder dot asterisk for my entire life. That phrase had been a goad, a whip. It was the voice of a standard I could never quite meet. It was the sting of inadequacy, the constant pressure to be more, to do more. It was the sentence I whispered to myself as Victor's hand closed on my arm. It was the mantra of endurance, of gritting my teeth and surviving. I reached up, my fingers tracing the deep grooves of the letters. The wood was rough, splintered. I could feel each cut he had made. And in the absolute silence of that empty garage, something inside me shifted. The meaning of the words rearranged itself. It was no longer a whip. It was not a command to endure more pain. I looked around at the silent, ordered space, at the benches where he had taken broken things and made them whole again. He was not a man who endured, he was a man who acted. He diagnosed a problem. He found the right tool, and he fixed it. He didn't try harder to bear the rattle of a broken engine, he tried harder to find the source and make it stop. The phrase wasn't about bearing the burden, it was about changing the circumstance. I closed my hand over the rough-hewn letters, my palm flat against the wood. For the first time, my father's words didn't feel like a weight. They felt like a hand on the small of my back, pushing me forward. It was not a whip. The end of the trading day approached not with a bell, but with the flat, digital finality of an executioner's report. At 4:06 p.m., a red banner flashed across my financial news terminal, trading halt. VXSY. News pending. The New York Stock Exchange had stepped in. The volatility was too great. The uncertainty too profound. The company was now in a black box, cut off from the market, its value frozen in a state of catastrophic decline. A second notification followed, this one from Mr. Silver's office. The court had reviewed the initial chaos, and had extended the temporary restraining order until the full preliminary hearing. The collar around Vinx's neck was not just tight. It was now locked in place. The machine was officially, publicly broken. I closed the news terminal window. The storm was raging, but it was outside my walls now. I had built a fortress, not of brick, but of data and legal precedent. At 4:07 p.m., a single, discrete notification appeared in the top corner of my monitor. It was from the encrypted portal for Northbridge Trust. It was not a flashy alert, it was a simple, quiet statement of fact. The final entry in a long and complicated ledger. Transaction complete. Settlement received. Beneficiary, Marinhex LLC. The numbers were there, a long string of them. But I didn't focus on them. I focused on the name of the recipient. It was not my name. It was the name of the entity I had created, the vessel for the future. The money was not a personal victory prize, it was capital. It was fuel. It was the foundation of something new, built from the ashes of something old. As I stared at the confirmation, my phone began to vibrate. A frantic, angry buzzing against the polished wood of my desk. The screen lit up with a name I had not deleted, a name I had kept for this exact moment, Mason Cole. I let it ring for a moment, listening to the sound of his desperation. Then I answered, putting the call on speaker. I did not say a word. Ava. His voice was a ragged gasp, stripped of all its former authority. It was thin, breathless. The sound of a man who had been running and had nowhere left to run. Ava, please, you can't. We can fix this. You can name your price. Just call them off. Tell your lawyers. He was stammering, his words tumbling over one another in a frantic, incoherent plea. Ava, you can't just. I did not need to hear the rest of the sentence. I had heard enough. While he was speaking, my fingers were moving across my keyboard. I already had the email open. It was a draft I had written 2 days ago, a final, clean piece of communication. It was not addressed to VINX or to Mr. Silver or to the courts. The to field contained a single address, mason.cole@mail.com. His personal account. The subject line was simple, subject, notice of final termination. The body of the email was even simpler. It contained a single sentence. All communication regarding this matter is now concluded. It was not an attack. It was a door closing and locking. It was the digital equivalent of a clean, single cut. It was the final word, and it was mine. I looked away from the screen, toward the new front door. The late afternoon light slanted through the window, catching the reflection in the small glass peephole. I saw my own face, pale and composed. The bruise on my wrist was gone, faded to a faint yellowish ghost that was hidden by my sleeve. The shadows under my eyes were still there, but my face itself was clear. It was my own. There were no marks on it. It was the face of a woman who was no longer a victim, no longer a target. Mason was still talking on the phone, his voice a pathetic, wheezing drone. Everything I worked for, my family. Ava, please, just think about, my cursor hovered over the blue send button. I thought about my father's hands, covered in grease, fixing what was broken. I thought about my mother's smile in the photograph on the shelf. I thought about the cold, sterile conference room, the smell of burnt coffee, and the weight of their judgment. I pressed the button. The screen flashed white for a fraction of a second, the color of a blank page, a cleared slate. Then it returned to the view of my inbox. The draft was gone. The outbox was empty. The action was complete. I reached over and ended the call, cutting off Mason's plea mid-syllable. The silence that filled the room was absolute. I picked up my phone, turned it over, and laid it face down on the desk. It was over. The ledgers were balanced. The accounts were closed. I leaned back in my chair and whispered the words into the quiet of the empty room, a final report to the ghosts of my past. I tried harder. Now we are done. The story has now concluded.